We're back on this October 7th, and Israel's military is expanding its offensive against Hezbollah. The country commemorates the deadly Hamas attacks 1 year ago. IDF calling up more reserve brigades, also widening evacuation warnings in southern Lebanon. So Israel's now fighting Iran's allies on multiple fronts. Let's bring Doug Ollivant in, senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You know, we had Jonathan Conricus on earlier, Doug. He said it's 7 fronts when he counted them all up, but either way, it's a lot. And Iran might be the most important. But his point was he thinks it's going to continue to expand. So it's not only a war that's going on for a year, but one that a lot of people think is going to, get even be even wider than it is now. What do you think?
Well, I think we certainly fear that it gets wider than it currently is. I think the policy of the United States, of course, is to try to contain this as much as possible and keep it from metastasizing. The last thing we want is a war that moves into some of these other countries, that gets really active with the Houthis, so they completely shut down the Red Sea, something that destabilizes Iraq, makes us give up our hard-won gains there, or something that forces the Iranians and the Saudis to get in a tit-for-tat over destroying each other's oil infrastructure and what that would do for oil prices. So those are all things that we want to avoid.
Right.
But the Israelis have a different calculus, and you have to admit that their perspectives are different. We live over here, surrounded by Canadians, Mexicans, and fish, and they live in a very, very difficult neighborhood. So their perspective and their analysis of their interest is simply different than ours.
Much different. Now, when you do look at our own perspective on it, it's interesting because we were just talking a minute ago about Kamala Harris being on 60 Minutes. The whole interview tonight is airing, but one of the clips they put out beforehand got into the relationships, particularly with Netanyahu. Let's watch.
Do we have a real close ally in Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think, with all due respect, the better question is, do we have an important alliance between the American people and the Israeli people? And the answer to that question is yes.
And what's your reaction to that answer, Doug?
Well, I think there's clearly great frustration inside this administration with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think, quite frankly, as you and I have discussed before, the suspicion inside the White House is that Prime Minister Netanyahu's motives are deeply tainted by the fact that were a ceasefire to come about, that would mean that they would want a new election and a new government. And then he has to face 2 things. He has to face accountability for the obvious failures on October 7th. That was not preordained. That could have been stopped by an infantry battalion and a couple attack helicopters overhead. So there was a clear failure on October 7th, and he was in charge of the government. And second, he has a range of other criminal charges that are hanging behind him that will probably come to haunt him when he is no longer the prime minister. So he personally has some incentive for this to ratchet on and perhaps expand.
Thanks so much for watching. Just go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.